It's 8 against 8, Cox against Cox, Oxford holding on, Cambridge desperately trying to close the gap. What a finishing prospect here. That's Chiswick Bridge in the background, the grit of the teeth of Smith and Livingston. Livingston in the Cambridge race, Oxford holding on there. This is extraordinary stuff. I mean, it really is about a minute to go.
The official records show that the 2003 Oxford-Cambridge boat race had the second closest finish of all the 159 contests held to date.
Quite extraordinary finishing here. What a race we've had. Coxon's race, the Stroke Man's race, and Cambridge still coming. Cambridge coming back again now.
Still their race, possibly. Oxford are holding on there. It's closing very much, but there's only about 10 strokes left to row.
This is a great finishing rhythm from Cambridge, but Oxford holding on. Cambridge closing. Oxford coming to the finishing post. This is going to be an unbelievable finish. Oxford have won. Oxford have won. Cambridge, so close. Oh, they can't believe it. Neither crew. One of the greatest finishes of all time. Barely more than the canvas.
Oh, less. It was a dead heat almost. I think it was almost a dead heat. I mean, quite extraordinary. There was only a couple of feet in it. As it's going to be down to Ben Kent, who's on the finishing line.
Ben Kent, an old blue and the third generation of his family to judge the boat race finish, correctly declared a win for Oxford by 1 foot, without recourse to modern methods. He used his eyes, the finish post opposite, and his own judgment.
And it's confirmed, Oxford are the winners.
Sadly, in the post-race banter between the three BBC commentators, a popular myth was perpetuated.
But now, how can you live with losing by a foot?
But it's actually the closest verdict to history, because in 1877 there was a dead heat, but he was a dead heat by 6 feet, ostensibly because the judge was been in the pub.
That commentator was a very successful oarsman in his time, and a respected voice on rowing matters today. The judge that had been in the pub that he referred to was honest John Phelps, the Finnish judge who gave the only dead heat verdict in boat race history. It was a decision that made 1877 one of the most controversial of all the 159 varsity races held to date. It also resulted in Phelps, a good and honourable man, suffering a great and continuing injustice, one which this film hopes to rectify. Let's try and get some facts. At 8:51 a.m. on the 24th of March 1877, the Oxford-Cambridge boat race approached the finish here at Mortlake. It was high water, and the Finnish judge, John Phelps, was moored in a skiff somewhere around this spot. Remarkably, we can hear the voice of one of the participants in that 34th boat race. William Grenfell, first Baron Desborough, rowed at 4 in the Oxford boat in 1877. In the late 1930s, he recorded his version of the events of that March day 50 years before.
As a survivor of the dead heat race in 1877, I've been asked to contribute a few words to this talk on the Oxford and Cambridge boat race. The race started at the uncomfortably early hour of 8:27 on March the 24th. The wind was from the west-northwest, the worst quarter, and blowing hard, and the tide was very slack. Cambridge had the Surrey station and Oxford the Middlesex. Cambridge used our slides well and had done fast times in practice. Oxford were well together and had a redoubtable body swing, set by H.P. Marriott's stroke and T.C. Edwards Moss No. 7, who had rowed together continuously for Brasenose College. The race was a ding-dong one to Barnes, but Oxford were a length ahead and going away, and the boat suddenly felt like a barge. Bow's oar had given way at the bottom in the very rough water above Barnes, and all that D.J. Cowles, who was rowing bow, could do was to hold it in the middle and try to keep the ends out of the water. Cambridge, though a tired crew, immediately shot up, but Oxford, with the advantage of the inside berth, struggled on to the end. We thought we'd won by a small margin. I was rowing number 4, and seemed to be rather in front of the Cambridge 2 when we stopped. and the boats were close together. We put away our boat first, and had taken up our places in the bows of the launch which took the crews back to Putney, and much to our disappointment, we were told it was a dead heat. The distance judge was a waterman, honest John Phelps, in a boat with a gun to fire at the finish. The umpire, Mr. J.W. Chitty, QC, afterwards Lord Justice Chitty, later in the day got Phelps to attend him at the law court and questioned him as to the position of the boats. But all Phelps could say was that he could not separate them. So ended the race of 1877, and though there have been many close races, there is not likely to be another dead heat.
Desbo's strange and bold assertion that there is not likely to be another dead heat is a very subtle reference to the fact that he considered Phelps to have been incompetent. Through the years, many other seemingly reliable sources have repeated and embellished different versions of what happened at the end of the 1877 boat race. The most popular is that John was drunk and asleep under a bush at the finish, only awakening to slur, dead heat, while adding under his breath, to Oxford by 6 feet. Tellingly, different sources have Phelps giving almost any distance between 4 feet and 10 yards. There are other common, though less popular stories about John's alleged failings. Put them all together and you have a senile, half-blind drunk who was asleep under a bush on a drifting skiff. His view is obscured, but he awakes to give a verdict of between 4 and 30 feet and calls it a dead heat. These tales have become so legendary that at times even members of the Phelps family have believed them. I went to one of the pre-boat race fixtures at Putney to speak to Richard Phelps, a descendant of Honest John, a 3 times varsity boat race winner, the umpire for the 2014 boat race, and a man who has mixed in rowing circles all his life. I asked him if he found that most people, both inside and outside of rowing, accept the stories about his ancestor as unquestionably true.
Yeah, I think they do actually, and I would say that actually so did I. I think before I began to research it and work with the likes of Morris, my second cousin, I think most people, including myself, took it for granted. Some of those, simple lines such as he'd been drinking all day, he didn't know what he was doing, he was asleep under a bush, all that sort of stuff. I think I accepted it. It's only when you begin to do a bit of research and, for example, discover the race was at 8:25 in the morning that you realise that there's absolutely no way could he have been drinking all day, and then you begin to unravel all the falsehoods that have clearly been going on for hundreds of years. And I do remember, I think it was the year Matthew Pinsent was president in '93. He was interviewed about if Oxford had won that year, they would have come level. And I remember Matthew interviewing saying actually Oxford already considered themselves as level because they considered that they'd won the 1877 race, and that was only down to the dishonesty of a Phelps.
So, Honest John became a figure of fun, and 1877 cast a long shadow over the Phelpses, a family that had served rowing well for generations. I met the Phelps family historian, Morris, at the Ship pub, which is near the boat race finish, but also, unfortunately, under a flight path. I first asked about the family's long involvement with the river and the effect of John's dead heat verdict upon them. What was, or is, the Phelps dynasty?
Well, the Phelps dynasty is the history of the family. And the family we've traced back to 1675, reign of Charles II, but we could have gone further. The Waterman Company actually has got records of them on their register dating 1560 to 1590.
Turning now to your ancestor John Phelps, who lived between 1805 and 1890, tell us about his life before the 1877 boat race.
Right. He came from a family of 11 children. His father was William Phelps. He was a waterman. So John grew up probably from the age of 3 or 4 in boats on the water. He was apprenticed to his father in 1821 and became a full waterman, registered in 1827. Rode for doggers at that time and spent the rest of his life on the water, on the Thames. However, he was also a competitive oarsman. In 1831, for example, he raced against a man called Kipping, who had just beaten Robert Coombs. Robert Coombs was one of the champions of the Thames. He became well known to Robert Coombs and joined his crew that did the famous racing with the Northeasterners, Claspers, etc. In the mid-1840s. He was a recognised competitive sportsman. The effects upon the family were traumatic. Honest John became a musical joke for years afterwards, and the effect upon the Phelps family by the fact that they were professionals and associated to John Phelps was devastating.
The tragedy is that the popular stories concerning John Phelps's conduct are simply not true, and that the dead heat verdict was the only one that could have been given. In the words of the boat race official centenary history, quote, "No good grounds have been shown for doubting the rightness of John Phelps's decision," unquote. While time makes it impossible to conclusively refute every claim made against John and his judgment, the most outrageous can be discredited. First, I asked Richard Phelps about Lord Desborough's claim that he could see that Oxford were up at the finish. As an oarsman, put yourself in Lord Desborough's place, and I apologise for putting you in an Oxford crew. Sitting at Oxford's fore, Desborough claimed to be rather in front of the Cambridge 2 at the finish. If you rode in a close race over 4¼ miles, are you likely to be in a fit state to make such a judgment?
Hopefully you're still functioning enough to know where you are relative to the other crew, but of course relative to the crew across what line. So, you know, on a 2,000 metre course like Dorney, which we all saw for the Olympics, where you've got buoys and you've got straight lines, yes, a quick glance across and you can determine whether you're up or down. On a bendy river, where there is no defined finish line, as there was in 1877, Desborough may have thought he was one man up versus his Cambridge counterpart, but I don't think he knew where the finish line was. So he may well have been down before they approached the finish line as much as been up. My grandfather always used to sit me down and tell me about how Honest John was taken to the chambers of the umpire Chitty to explain what happened, and how he had to describe the fact that at the time the bows were surging with the relevant finish, and after 4¼ miles, with only that between them, the only honourable and sensible answer was the dead heat.
After talking to Richard, I then asked Maurice Phelps about some of the other stories frequently told about the 1877 boat race. Was he drunk and asleep under a bush when the race finished?
Well, there is no evidence that he was. The time, we must remember, is 8:30 in the morning, and it is extremely unlikely that anybody, no matter how fond they were of drink, would at that time be either drunk or under a bush. It's an insulting, actually, remark to make for a man who actually claimed, and there's no reason to doubt the claim, that he only ever drank beer. He was not a man who imbibed a great deal, a man who had kept himself fit for his entire life. The whole idea that he was not in a fit state to judge is, I believe, unsubstantiated by anybody who was present. It was something which was a myth, made up. And it was made up, I believe, because the man was a professional. He came up with a view, a decision which nobody particularly liked, because the Oxford and Cambridge boat race is a win-lose race, and therefore there was as much offence directed his way as they could possibly gather. And of course the famous phrase is his declaration, which he never ever made, and there's no indication that he did, that it was a dead heat, Oxford by 5 feet.
There were problems with the technical aspects of the finish, weren't there?
Well, there were, but there always had been. There was no post. the finishing line was a finishing line which people actually had from memory almost. But John knew it well. I mean, the man had been judging the race for 10 years before this particular incident. He was a man who would ensure that he was in a position to provide a judgment which was a fair judgment on the race.
It was suggested that John's skiff had drifted off the finish line, and that certainly there was general mayhem on the river in those unregulated days.
There would have been certainly mayhem, there always is, with the in those days with the University Boat Race. It was a very popular event, etc. But John Phelps was an experienced waterman. He had been on the river since about the age of 4. As an experienced waterman, he would never have allowed his boat to drift on line. Accusations of that nature are almost professionally insulting for the man. In addition to that, he would have ensured that he had the clearest possible view. Now, whether it was absolutely clear or not, but he would have been a man who would have insisted that he was in a position to make the judgment. And of course it was a very brave judgment.
Despite what this rather unflattering studio portrait seems to indicate, John was not the stereotypical waterman, that is, a coarse and drunken rogue. He was in fact quite the opposite. There follows an extract from Morris's book in which he describes some perhaps unexpected aspects of John's character. All the evidence suggests that honest John Phelps was a sensitive, hard-working and responsible individual. John Phelps was a man who collected works of art, commented on social conditions, and, importantly for the time, condemned animal cruelty. This was not a man who would neglect critical duties. In many ways, on the day concerned, with Oxford virtually celebrating victory without any official verdict, it was great honour to the man to have the strength of character to declare a dead heat. It would hardly make him popular. How easy would it have been for a professional of advancing years, probably anxious to keep his appointment, to have embraced the popular sentiment of an Oxford win. But he did not. Why was John vilified in the way that he was?
I think one's got to put the incident into some form of perspective. I don't want to overdo it, but we must remember that during this period, from about 1840 through to 1880, there became a real drive by the amateur world to preserve the honour, the spirit of amateur oarsmanship. And therefore they began to exclude the professionals from the rowing competitive world. This was almost clear class distinction. It certainly excluded from that point on all watermen from competitive amateur activity. And I believe that this was part of that process. And although one would never say that there was some form of conspiracy here, there's no doubt at all that the amateur world took full advantage of this incident to expedite, I think, the exclusion of professionals whom they would regard as untrustworthy and not competent actually to participate in their sport.
None of the lurid tales about John appeared immediately after the race. They emerged at some later point. If Phelps was absent from the finish at the vital moment, whether under a bush or not, it surely would have been noticed by the umpire, the two crews, and the press and supporters in the following launches, but none mentioned it at the time. Some of the Cambridge 8 rather half-heartedly claimed a foul at the finish, but this was immediately dismissed by umpire Chitty. Oxford raised no objections. I visited the River and Rowing Museum in Henley to talk to its historian Chris Dodd, who was also the author of the 1983 book, The Oxford and Cambridge Boat Race. Chris claims that it was only after the Dark Blues had returned to Oxford that they, and the town, quote, daily became more imbued with the idea that they had won, unquote. So Chris, before we talk about the 1877 boat race, the museum has a couple of nice artefacts relating to the race.
Well, yes, it has the bow of what purports to be in the Cambridge boat, or the boat used by Cambridge in the dead heat race. And the immediate thing you will notice about that is that it doesn't have a bow ball on it, which is relevant to what we're going to talk about.
That silver cup is rather interesting.
The silver cup was presented to the Koch of the Oxford boat by, we don't really know who, by a friend. It says, in memory of the famous dead heat, the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life.
And that's quite interesting because it doesn't say the Victorian equivalent of "we was robbed." It seems quite accepting of the result.
It does seem accepting of the result, and I mean the interesting thing in a way about the dead heat is that most of the reports claim that Oxford won it, or most of the reports at the time, including the press reports. But Oxford do not seem to have made a big fuss about the eventual verdict of a dead heat. Neither did Cambridge. And both clubs eventually presented their own boat race medals to their crews, which would normally only be done if you were a winning crew.
If you could put on your journalist's hat for a minute, you were a sub-editor on The Guardian for 25 years. In 1877, many of the papers prematurely reported that Oxford had won, and perhaps needed a way to cover their embarrassment. As even today, we see examples of the press acting arrogantly. Do you think that it's likely that some newspapers decided to propagate the idea that they were right, and that was the judge who was not only wrong, but incompetent?
It's impossible to say really whether that was the case, but the difficulties the press would have had was, first of all, they'd never witnessed such a close finish. Secondly, they're under pressure to get a story out, and of course what happens at the end of this race is that Phelps disappears from view, and the umpire does not get Phelps's report as the finish judge until several hours later. Meanwhile, the newspapers, particularly the correspondents of evening papers, because this race was held fairly early in the day, would have been under pressure to get a story out, and they can't imagine a situation without a winner, and nobody will confirm that it's a dead heat. So, and they also might have been doing runners, which means writing the story of the beginning of the race while the race is under progress on the press launch. And there was a technique of putting copy into a floating canister and throwing it to a boy in a rowing boat who would take it to the telegraph office. So then at the end of the race you've got to, get the final paragraph out saying what the result is. So that's difficult. And the other thing is that, having followed more than 30 boat races in the press launch, you have the dreadful problem of parallax, as does everybody following a boat race. Nobody is in the position to actually accurately forecast or see the lead of a very narrow finish, except the guy on the finishing line. And as we've said before, Phelps didn't actually have a finishing line. So I don't think there's a sort of conspiracy by the press. There would have been a discussion amongst the reporters as to who did win, who do you think won, and what would the distance be. And as we know, the recorded time for the 1877 race, although there were accurate watches, there weren't accurate finish points, and there are 5 or 6 times have been published as to the actual time that race took.
Chris then read an extract from the book The Complete Oarsman by R.C. Lehman, a man who coached both Oxford and Cambridge at various times during the 1890s. Lehman reported what umpire Chitty had told him of his post-race meeting with John Phelps, something that was necessary before Chitty could declare the official verdict.
Lehman says, when Phelps was questioned as to the result of the race, he placed the 2 palms of his hands together and moved them slightly backwards and forwards, and said, "They were going like this, sir, I couldn't separate them." So what Phelps is doing is this action, which illustrates two boats alongside each other. When you take a rowing stroke, it's not an even movement. So when the blades are in the water as part of the rowing cycle, there's going to be a slight surge of the boat, and it's going to drop back when the blades are recovering for the next stroke. And if there are two boats alongside each other and their cycles are not in sync, then one bow is going to show and then the other bow is going to show. And it could well have been that close, but I think that's what he's describing to the umpire, who was also a judge, Chitty. And Chitty wouldn't have been able to see either, because he would be in a launch some way behind the race. Impossible to tell which one was in the lead.
This is the rather sad remains of Waterman's Green, situated next to the new Putney Bridge of 1886. As this picture shows, the green was situated between Putney Aqueduct on the left here and Old Putney Bridge on the right. Today's bridge is just to the right of the aqueduct, as shown here. Waterman's Green was the spot where, before 1886, John Phelps, the official Putney ferryman, would have waited for passengers wanting to be rowed across to the Fulham side. Perhaps in quiet times he would have sat here and pondered on the events of the 24th of March 1877. Phelps gave the only fair decision that could have been made in a close race without a marked line of sight. Up to that point, no one had thought finish markers were necessary. John did not take the easy and popular option of declaring for Oxford the favourites, and for this he and the family paid a high price. In the words of Maurice Phelps, the dead-heat decision was not only brave, but almost stoic. While Phelps has had many knowledgeable and respectable supporters, it's unfortunate that if a lie is big enough and told often enough, people will believe it. It's also far more amusing to tell the drunk under a bush story than the rather more prosaic truth that the two boats could not be separated at the finish. After 137 years, it's time that the lies and stories were laid to rest, and that John Phelps, a sober, cultured and moral man, received due and proper recognition for his fair and courageous verdict.